Welcome to What is Going Om, for new thought from the edge of Om. Each week on OMTimes' flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Om. Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. Stories of spirit communication, near-death experiences, and deathbed visions have always been a part of the human experience. And given that there have been so many books and TV programs focused on these topics of late, one might almost consider such experiences to now be an accepted fact. But still, there are those who find it hard to believe in an afterlife, let alone that there could be communication with people who are dead. If you're among them, stay tuned, because today's guest has unparalleled credentials and experience in the paranormal world. And the stories and science he'll be sharing are extremely difficult to ignore. Mccartney JD, also known as the Psychic Lawyer, is a world-renowned fourth-generation science-based evidential psychic medium who communicates with spirits, a legal analyst and frequent speaker at international conferences, universities, and on radio and TV. He is the author of the groundbreaking and critically acclaimed spiritual bestsellers Evidence of Eternity, Never Letting Go, and The Afterlife Frequency, the scientific proof of spiritual contact and how that awareness will change your life. This book bridges the divide between faith and science with a fascinating afterlife exploration that combines physics, neuroscience, and riveting true stories. Mccartney, welcome.
Thank you, Sandie. It's an honor to be on the show.
Mark, you're an Oxford-educated trial attorney, licensed to practice before the United States Supreme Court. You studied mediumship in England at the prestigious Arthur Findlay College for the advancement of psychic science, which incidentally is just a stone's throw from where I'm sitting right now.
Oh, that's great! I love England. I love Southern England. Stansted is so beautiful.
And that particular college, I mean, it's just a beautiful building in a beautiful grounds and does some beautiful work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have so many fond memories of England and Oxford, of course, but such cherished memories of the Arthur Findlay College.
And certainly a deep history of communication with the other side in this country.
Yeah, that's true. And Britain has always been at the forefront of the understanding of spirit communication. Certainly spiritualism developed very heavily in the mid-19th century. Queen Victoria, in fact, was a big proponent of spirit communication, particularly after her beloved Prince Albert died. And, Sandie, and I'm sure you're aware of these, but there's rumors that she met a teenage psychic, Edward Lees, who was able to facilitate contact between her and Prince Albert. And rumor has it she actually had him moved into Buckingham Palace for a period of time. So and I discovered in my research that First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's widow, used to keep in touch with Queen Victoria. And Mary Todd Lincoln herself was a huge proponent of psychic mediums and consulted with them often, particularly after her son Willie Todd Lincoln died, and then, of course, after her husband Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So Britain's always been on the cutting edge and the forefront of psychic science. And I also believe, based on my research, that Britain was the first country to actually develop a clandestine psychic warfare division in the 1930s.
Yes.
So there's a lot of really fun stuff with Great Britain and spirit communication.
I wonder whether that is because we have a history that goes way back and there were the Druids and people before them. And so it's kind of in our DNA, so to speak, these ancient stories and belief systems and knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, every place on earth is spiritual. I mean, spirituality is everywhere. But I've spent such a great deal of time in Britain. I've spent a lot of time in Wales, Scotland, and of course England. And there's just something there. And it's funny because my counterparts, my friends who are mediums in Britain, they always make a joke that a rainy day is the best day to conduct spirit communication. And then they say, but of course it rains every day in England.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's been doing a lot of that of late. But Mark, you were born into a family where psychic and mediumistic abilities have spanned generations. So it's in your DNA too.
It absolutely is. My father, his family was very, waspy, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and they were from Pennsylvania. And they were of the Baptist faith. In fact, his grandfather founded a Baptist church in the small town that he grew up in Pennsylvania. And my dad was in the U.S. Navy, and he was a Navy SEAL. And so he was at a USO dance after he got out of the military, and he spotted. It's so funny, Sandie. He said, I spotted this really foxy dame. That's how he used to talk. And, of course, that was my mother. And he thought she was maybe 30 years old because she looked so sophisticated. Well, my mother worked at a high-end department store in the fashion department. And Mom said, well, yeah, I dressed to the nines because I got the employee discount. And so her family had emigrated from Italy. And in fact, her grandmother, who's my great-grandmother, Giovanna, was actually, it's documented in a special that Public Broadcasting, PBS, did about the Italian Americans. And it was a 4-hour special, and they did an entire segment and actually referenced Giovanna, had pictures of her, and referenced her psychic abilities. So I've tracked these back into the 1890s. I'm assuming it goes further. So, but to make a long story short, so my parents connected, and after a few dates, my mother said, there's something that I need to tell you about me. And she says, I can see spirits. And my dad goes, oh, dear Lord, I do too.
Well, I'm surprised that given that, from the very beginning, you got a chance to really develop that right brain intuitive side of yourself, why you chose to be a lawyer, which is such a left-brained activity.
That, Sandie, I'm laughing because not a day goes by that I reflect on that. Initially, I had wanted to go into the clergy, and that's not unusual for a medium. We're drawn to the spiritual. But I felt there were too many rules and regulations. And then I decided to go into law. Now, talk about jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire when it comes to rules and regulations. But I liked the law because I liked the logical approach. I liked public speaking. I liked the ability to help people with difficult problems. And, Sandie, I think that a lot of our life is predestined, and I think that I was supposed to go through that incredibly left-brained profession because those transferable skills, when I went public as a medium, have been invaluable. And that's why I take an evidential approach to mediumship. That's why I went to Arthur Findlay College, because I admire British evidential mediumship. And think about it, Sandie, both of the things that I have done, being a lawyer, you need evidence, but you also help people. And then being a medium, yes, you're helping people by facilitating communication with their loved ones in spirit, but you have to have credibility by bringing forth pieces of information that can be objectively verified. In other words, evidence.
You probably get this question a lot. I mean, the fact that you're psychic and the fact that you're a medium, did that ever interfere with your job as a lawyer? Because you'd be, dealing with somebody perhaps who was telling a different story to what you knew to be true.
Yeah, well, that's true. And at the risk of being facetious, I was a prosecuting attorney for the state of Florida, and then I shifted over to criminal defense, and then my practice grew to not just encompass criminal work, but also civil trial work involving personal injury and accident cases. And at the risk of being facetious, it's almost a foregone conclusion, particularly in the criminal arena, that people are going to lie to you. And my job is not to sit in judgment of somebody, but rather to protect their rights. So they may tell me one thing, and the police reports and eyewitness statements tell me another. My job is to make sure that their rights are protected. And so every attorney goes through that, but especially when you can pick up on things about the person that they're not telling you.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your latest book. I have to tell you, Mark, that I read a lot of books, and I've interviewed a lot of people who've had near-death experiences. Some of them channels, mediums of all kinds. Read a lot of those books. And I think yours actually had me riveted because it is the first one that explains exactly what is going on and gives us the science behind it, which is so necessary.
Well, thank you. I wrote my first book, Never Letting Go, as a guide to help people get through grief and how spirits can help you do that. I wrote Evidence of Eternity because I wanted to explain things more clearly. But I wanted to go even further with the Afterlife Frequency, because here's why, Sandie. As an attorney, and as an attorney, I had to deal with forensics. I had to deal with chemists. I had to deal with biologists, accident reconstruction. I had to deal with physicists, because in all the different types of cases. Also, I specialized in head injury litigation, so I had to study the human brain. And I started seeing that all of this was for a reason, and I believe that everything has a logical explanation, including the afterlife, including the existence of God, including spirit communication. And so that is what motivated me to take all of those disciplines and then do the deeper research into quantum physics, because that's where it all can be explained, is how everything on the quantum level is also affecting us on a constant basis.
Yeah. So explain to us, how does this communication happen?
I'm sorry, how did...
Communication with people who are dead, the information that you get from people as a medium, how is that, what is the science behind that? What is happening to facilitate that?
Well, that's one of the reasons I wrote the Afterlife Frequency, but I'll give you a cursory view of that. Sandie, everybody is capable of having a psychic or mediumistic experience, although not everybody is a medium. There's a lot of mediums that go around saying, well, I'm going to turn you into a medium and take my course. Well, that's like me saying, you know what, Sandie, I'm going to turn you into a world-class tennis player, and after a few lessons, you're going to beat Serena Williams on the tennis court, okay? And the thing is, we all have the same basic physiology. We have a pineal gland in our brain, and we have the solar plexus at the bottom of the rib cage, just above the pit of the stomach. And these are the two psychic receptor areas. The pineal gland is a pea-sized, lima bean-sized gland about 4 inches behind the center of the forehead, the proverbial third eye. So for your listeners who engage in yoga and for people who work with chakras, the location of the chakras align with the locations of our endocrine glands. And so the pineal gland, and it was actually the British who discovered that within the pineal gland are calcite and magnetite crystals. Ergo, there's an electromagnetic field. And if you think about it, Sandie, the first radios were a piece of quartz crystal with low levels of electricity running through it. So essentially, we have a radio station in our heads. Then, in our solar plexus, some doctors have referred to this as the second brain, because the solar plexus, which is the yellow chakra, the chakra associated most closely with the pancreas, that endocrine gland, is the second most complex bundle of nerves and ganglia in the body outside of the cerebral cortex. So that's where you get emotional impressions. Sandie, let me ask you this. You have women's intuition, right?
Yes.
Okay. And do you ever get a feeling in your stomach when something isn't quite right?
Absolutely.
And that's because your solar plexus is sensitive to those vibrations. And so one of the first skills in developing spiritual situational awareness is trusting your intuition and your feelings. Now, for men, because men, we tend to, I don't have feelings. But if you turn it into a Harrison Ford, Denzel Washington, Chris Pratt approach to things and say your gut instinct, wait a second, your gut, that means your solar plexus. So men are just as psychic as women. It's just, we got to get us, I got to get my gender on board with this. So we have the apparatus in the solar plexus to pick up on emotional and physical sensations, and then the pineal gland picks up on the auditory and the visual impulses that are transmitted to us through the quantum field by spirits.
Yep. But there's something else going on there. I mean, you talk, the title of the book is Frequency. And there is a certain frequency level that one has to tap into, surely, to be able to facilitate that communication.
Absolutely. And so what I just described is the equipment. Now let's talk about frequency. Okay. So think of everyone that you love being connected to you by a three-dimensional spider web. Let's take the spider out of it, okay? But how does the spider detect something when it hits its web? It's through a vibration.
Yeah.
So if something hits the web, there's a vibration that goes along that web to the spider. This is a concept that I call frequency beacons. And so energetically, we know that everything is composed of molecules, which are made of atoms, which in turn are made of smaller particles, electrons, protons, and neutrons, which in turn are made of subatomic particle known as quanta, which is pure electromagnetic energy. So what this means, Sandie, is that everything in existence on the most basic level is electromagnetic energy, which vibrates. So let's say that you have lost a loved one. That person didn't die. It's merely that the electromagnetic field in their brain, which I've termed the electromagnetic soul, that describes what we really are, which is pure electromagnetic energy that is eternal consciousness. And so that electromagnetic energy leaves the body and goes to a higher frequency. In other words, we live in AM radio, spirits live in FM, okay? So we want to talk to them, and through a frequency beacon, you start grieving very heavily, and you're sending that vibration. A spirit will pick up on it. And that's why a lot of people say, since my mother died, I feel her around me because you're grieving. But spirits can also emit waves of frequency to you. Let's say you're driving in your car, and suddenly you feel compelled to turn on the radio, and there's that song that just tugs your heartstrings. Or maybe you smell a familiar scent, a cologne, a pipe smoke, or something, and there's no source for it. It's like, my God, that smells like my grandfather's pipe. Well, what's happening is spirits can emit these waves of frequency to you as well, and when you start being sensitive to these signs, you'll realize that they're communicating with us all the time.
Right. So if it's all about electromagnetics, then why do we not have some kind of technology that would allow us to actually use that technology to communicate rather than using ourselves? Like a phone.
Well, God, I'm so glad you asked that question. Actually, Thomas Edison was working on that. He called it the spirit phone. And in the 1920s, he was interviewed in a couple different magazines, and he believed that it was possible to develop a device sensitive enough to communicate with discarnate intelligence, in other words, a spirit. Unfortunately, he died and before he was able to do that. I do know that at the University of Arizona, the parapsychology department is currently working on technology that they're calling the soul phone. But in the meantime, we are the technology. We're the biotechnology. And some people say, well, why don't you just hook somebody's up to an EEG, an electroencephalogram, or a QEEG, a quantitative electroencephalogram, and just tune into their electromagnetic soul and find out about the afterlife frequency? Well, first off, the EEG and QEEG are wonderful diagnostic tools for injuries, but they're not designed to communicate with the afterlife, nor are they sensitive enough to detect the electromagnetic soul. And there are frequencies and harmonics which exist, and this is what's the theory, that are beyond our current level of technology to communicate with. That being said, there are technological devices that are being used by paranormal investigators, such as trimeters, K2 meters, spirit boxes, infrared detectors, which have been quite possibly detecting the presence of spirits and even picking up on their voices. And I've been to a number of paranormal investigations, and I have seen evidence that would indicate that there's definitely a spirit communicating. So the technology is there. It's still on a rudimentary level, but I believe, and I firmly believe this, Sandie, that within the 21st century, humans will have developed technology sensitive enough to tune into and directly communicate with the other side.
I wouldn't mind betting that someone right now is writing a script for a TV series about this.
And they are free to have me star in it, so I'll put that out there too.
Okay, we're going to take a short break now, Mark. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest today is Oxford-educated attorney, world-renowned fourth-generation psychic medium, and popular TV and radio guest, Mark Antony, also known as the Psychic Lawyer, who is the best-selling author of many books about the afterlife, and especially the one we're discussing today, which is the Afterlife Frequency, the scientific proof of spiritual contact and how that awareness will change your life. We'll be back with more from Mark Antony after this break.
The future of internet radio is here. OMTimes Radio, IOM FM. Being a radio host on IOM FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
Vox Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Furman. Join me every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio for Vox Novus, the new voice.
Mental health. Most people think it means mental illness. Most people are wrong. Mental health doesn't apply to just some of us. It applies to everyone. We're all susceptible to anxiety and depression. They're human conditions, and no person should ever feel embarrassed, ashamed, or be discriminated against for being human. Cracked the podcast strips away the shame, fear, and stigma by expanding the conversation into areas less often visited. From brain and body chemistry, hormones, food, nutrition, trauma, and the microbiome, to pharmaceutical drugs, psychedelic substances, meditation, visionary experiences, and spiritual awakenings. Cracked the podcast will explore them all, including the notion that, for many, breakdown can be the beginning of breakthrough. For in the words of singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen, there is a crack in everything. It's where the light gets in. Cracked the podcast, slaying the dragons of mental health. Join co-hosts Sandie Sedgbeer and Rebecca Shaper on the first and third Thursday of every month at 12 noon Eastern Time.
Coping-19, brought to you by CDC and the Ad Council.
If you're feeling increasingly lonely right now, you're not alone. It's totally normal. Even though we may not be able to get together in person, connecting virtually with friends and family still gives you a chance to interact with people and may help raise your spirits. Join a virtual book club, set up group text chats, or online video coffee breaks with coworkers.
Find more self-care and coping tips at coping-19.org.
Welcome back, Mark Anthony. I always enjoy a book that tells me things I don't know. And your book is actually full of things that have not been shared, certainly in my experience before. One of them being that spirits are never alone and tend to come forth in tandem as a collective. Why is that?
It's the nature of energy. And think of your soul as a drop of water. And what both physics and faith are on the same page. People of faith believe that we have a soul, and that a soul pre-exists the body, comes into the body, and then leaves the body when we physically die. And the laws of physics teach us that energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred from one form to another. So when we physically die, the drop of water, our electromagnetic soul, plunges into the eternal sea of consciousness and then is energetically interconnected with soul, an infinite number of souls. The thing is, Sandie, we are too. We are too. We are energetically interconnected with everything because as we discussed in the previous segment, how everything on the subatomic level is electromagnetic energy and that we're all quantum entangled with each other. It's just that with spirits, because they're not dealing with the lower, slower vibration of our material world dimension, they are free of that and are able to interact more rapidly. And this has been referenced by theologians and by observers for millennia. Buddhism believes that consciousness is an ongoing stream. The Hindus believe in the concept of the Atman, which is the soul. Christians and Muslims certainly believe in the existence of the soul prior to the body and then continuing on after the body. But in my research, what I've seen is that when spirits come forward, they're never alone. But that drop of water maintains individuality. So while they're part of the collective consciousness, when you die, you take you with you. And so that's why during a spirit communication session, it's not unusual for many people to come through. I did a reading recently where 11 spirits came through, including this woman's dog that she had when she was a little girl, and it was really fascinating. So that is just what dealing with spirit communication is like. In fact, Edgar Cayce, he was nicknamed the Sleeping Prophet, and he passed back in the 1940s, and he founded the Edgar Cayce Association for Research and Enlightenment, which is a wonderful organization. It's in full swing to this day. I've spoken at their center in Virginia Beach a number of times. Edgar Cayce referred to this phenomenon as the universal mind. In esoteric Christianity, it has been referred to as Christ consciousness. So I'm giving it a 21st century term and going further by explaining it in terms of quantum physics and based on my direct connections with it.
You talk about the light of the electromagnetic soul, and we're hearing more and more about photons of light and how they impact us. When I was reading about that in your book, I was reminded of the documentary that was made about George Harrison. I don't know if you saw it, Living in a Material World. And towards the end of the documentary, George Harrison's wife, his widow, actually said that if you had been in the room with George when he died, as she was, and the way she described it is, well, let's just say that you wouldn't have needed lights in that room. So what she was saying was that there was a burst of light as his soul left his body.
Absolutely. And first off, thank you for referencing George Harrison. I think he was he was always one of my favorite celebrities because of his spirituality and his humble nature. And what Olivia Harrison was describing is what is known as a shared death experience. And this is the new frontier in near-death experience research. And many people have seen this happen when they're in close proximity to a loved one who's dying. They may start feeling the presence of other spirits around, and when the person transitions, they will see a surge of light. The room gets lighter, brighter. They may hear beautiful music. They may actually even see a transparent replica of their loved one emerging from the person's body. If you'll indulge me just for a moment, Sandie, Paul McCartney, last winter, he put out his album McCartney 3, and it became a bestseller. Hit the top of the charts, and it was great to hear that. And he was interviewed in the media, and they were making fun of him because of something that he said when actually what he was describing was a frequency beacon. Paul said that years ago, George Harrison, who loved gardening, gave him a tree. And Paul planted the tree in his yard. It's a fir tree. And he said that it's lovely, and it's gotten quite large over the years. And he said, and every time I'm near that tree, I feel the spirit of George with me. Now, of course, the media said Paul McCartney thinks George Harrison's in a tree in his yard, and Paul talks to trees. Okay, so they're making fun of him. But see, earlier when we were talking about, you asked, well, spirit communication, and I was explaining about frequency beacons. I believe what Paul McCartney described was a frequency beacon. So, yeah, George gave him this tree. George loved gardening. It's a living entity, and all things, even inanimate objects, have an electromagnetic field, but a tree certainly does. And so when Paul sees the tree, he begins to think about George. He is emitting an electromagnetic frequency out of his brain. The spirit of George picks up on that frequency beacon. It draws him to Paul, ergo, Paul feels George's spirit. And so frequency beacons happen to everyone. I mean, how many times people say that everywhere I go, I look and I see a coin, and that particular coin makes me think of my brother who died. Okay? Yeah. Well, spirits can direct our attention to things, maybe to a coin or a dragonfly or a particular type of bird, or in Paul McCartney's case, a tree.
Yeah. And spirit communicates in so many different ways, one of them being the sleep space. I have a question about that, because I've had several experiences after somebody's died, not necessarily immediately after, sometimes years after, where that person shows up in my dream. And it's a lucid dream, because at some point I actually say, hang on, you're supposed to be dead. They never speak. They're just there, but they never speak. Why would that be?
Well, it varies, because I've talked to hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have reported similar occurrences, and they do report that the person speaks to them. But let me ask you this. When you have that, because there's a difference between a visitation and a dream. Dreams have that surrealistic quality, and it's nonsensical, but a visitation has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and like you described, Sandie, it feels real. But you just know what that person's conveying to you, although they don't speak in an auditory fashion. The reason for that is because spirits communicate by electromagnetic frequency. See, we're communicating by that now, but we're using sound waves to hit the microphone, and then the sound wave energy gets converted into electrical energy. It's converted into radio wave energy, then to microwave energy from a system of satellites, then back into radio wave energy at the collection point, and then it comes out of a speaker as mechanical energy, which is actually sound wave energy. And all that happens at the speed of light, okay? Well, spirits don't have to worry about all that. They're just transferring that feeling, that emotion directly to you. And the sleep state is one of the most popular, I guess would be the word, popular forms of how spirits choose to communicate with us, because what happens is we have 5 different brain waves: gamma, beta, alpha, theta, and delta. Gamma is like super high functioning. That's when you're working on a calculus problem, and Beta is the state we're in now. That's the normal function, do everyday work. But then when you slip into alpha, which is as you begin to be very relaxed, the meditative state, and then theta, which is really deep in the dream state. It's on the alpha-theta border that brainwave frequency is conducive to and relaxed enough to be receptive to a spirit's frequency transmission. And so that's why spirits tend to communicate with us in our dreams. Also, people tend to be more accepting of a spiritual experience in a dream. I dreamt of my mother, and it felt real, as opposed to you walk into the office, pour yourself a cup of coffee, and go, hey, my Aunt Betty, her spirit's standing right next to you. Okay, you say that at work, people are going to start rolling their eyes and thinking you're bonkers. But when the spirit communication comes to you in the dream state, people tend to be much more accepting, and that's a good thing.
What is happening when somebody is dying and maybe they've had Alzheimer's for a long time and yet suddenly they have moments of complete lucidity and speak to their loved ones as if they had no problem with their memory or anything?
This is a very interesting phenomenon which has been documented for thousands of years, and in more recent decades it's been termed as terminal lucidity. And what that means is that somebody who is dying and in a mentally non-responsive state, it could be Alzheimer's, it could be brain damage, it could be brain cancer, it could be all types of severe stroke, damage from a stroke, and that's what is confounding neuroscientists. Neuroscience is the study of the human brain, and one thing neuroscientists all agree on is that right before you die, you don't suddenly grow a billion new neurons. But what people have been documenting, including scientists, is right before somebody passes and they're mentally in a non-responsive and irreversible brain damage state, suddenly regain consciousness. Based on, I've observed this phenomenon myself, and I've also communicated with people who were essentially brain dead, yet their body was still alive. Their spirit is perfectly capable of communicating. What this proves to us, Sandie, is that the brain does not create consciousness. It merely hosts it the way a computer hard drive hosts the data and the programs on the hard drive. And so that when somebody is dying, their electromagnetic soul is beginning to emerge, to leave, and it creates a spike in activity with that person that is not currently explainable through medical science.
You developed a 4-step process to help people become more aware of the presence of spirits and spot the signals and messages. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's kind of funny how I came up with that. Funny and wonderful. And I was writing the Afterlife Frequency, and I was trying to figure out, how do I explain to people who aren't mediums how to recognize and understand messages from spirits? And so I had the dreaded writer's block. So I thought, all right, I'm going to go for a walk on the beach because I live near the ocean. And I got up and I left my house, and all of a sudden I did an about face and decided like I was being guided in another direction towards this bicycle path. So I'm walking down the path by myself, and I see these two objects shining. And I walk up to them, and it's a nickel and a penny, a 5-cent piece and a 1-cent piece. And I could hear my mother's voice saying, if their head's down, don't touch it. That's bad luck, And I laughed because my mother's family was Italian, and they had a superstition for everything, But then I hear my father's voice saying, "It's money, grab it." So I pick them up, and I'm looking at them. I go, "Oh, 6 cents." And I go, 6 cents, and I realize I just heard my parents' voices. I'm holding 6 cents, the 6th cents in my hands. I'm getting cold chills and tingles through my body, so I know, okay, their spirits are here. I'm picking up on them. That's the cold chills and tingles. And then I see an image of my father standing in the ocean. He was not just a Navy SEAL, but a scuba diver and a diving and swimming instructor, and he's holding a blue raft. He always had this blue raft. It was made out of this canvas. And I go, raft, and all of a sudden it hit me, recognize, accept, feel, trust. I go, that's what he means. That's what people have to do. Recognize. I saw the coins on the ground. I heard my parents' voices, so I recognized that was a sign from them. I immediately accepted it as real. I felt the message without, this is where people go wrong, is on the F part. They start overanalyzing, overthinking, and negating it. You got to feel it and then trust the message. So within a span of about 10 seconds, I not only saw these coins, heard my parents, saw the image of my father, the raft, and then he hit me with recognize, accept, feel, and trust. And so I took that, I ran back, and I immediately wrote this down before it might fade away. And I developed the raft technique, and throughout the book, this applies to mediums and non-mediums. Also, the raft technique, Sandie, is not just for recognizing signs with spirits. It's also for if you're around somebody that's having a deathbed vision, that they're in the process of dying and they're seeing spirits, or if you get caught up in that deathbed vision in what I call a shared death experience, or if somebody has a near-death experience, using the raft technique can help you recognize, accept, feel, trust, understand, and apply everything that you have learned from that experience.
You have, I mean, the book is very entertaining, and you have lots of incredible true stories. Difficult to pick one out, but there is one that I think, everybody would really be surprised about, and that was the one about the hot shots, the firefighters. Would you just share that story with us?
Yeah, the hot shots is amazing. Hot shots, when it comes to firefighting, the special forces of firefighters are elite teams known as hot shots, and they're about a dozen, anywhere from 20 to 22 personnel. And hot shots can be deployed anywhere in the world to fight like when Australia was being overwhelmed with the fires, I believe it was last year, hot shots from the U.S. and other countries were sent there. And there was a gentleman, Hernandez, and his hotshot team, they were deployed in a mountain fire. And mountain weather is tricky under any circumstances, and fighting a fire on top of a mountain is even worse because the weather is very unpredictable. And suddenly the wind changed direction, and the fire started moving at them at probably 100 miles an hour. I mean, because that's what happens. And trees were exploding, and so here's like 20 guys, and they immediately hit the ground, cover themselves with protective equipment, and the fire engulfed them. And Hernandez knew that he was suffocating because the fire sucked all the oxygen out of the air, and he was choking. And the next thing he knows, he's floating above the mountain, and he's looking, and he sees all the other hotshots. They're also floating, and they're all looking at him, and they were communicating telepathically, just like what you were describing in the dream that you had. Sandie, how spirits will communicate without actually verbalizing. And he noticed that one of his fellow hotshots, Jose, had a deformed foot in real life. He was born that way, but his foot was fine. And he said, Jose, your foot's fine. And Jose's like, I know. And then the next thing, his near-death experience progressed into he went into the light and encountered his great-grandfather and other spirits that he knew, and he said it was so beautiful and peaceful that he wanted to keep going, but essentially they sent him back. Next thing he knows, he's choking, gasping on the ground. He said he was in horrible pain, felt terrible. He pulled the cover off of him. The top of the mountain was charred to a crisp, and all the hot shots were alive. And they all regrouped, and these are very serious guys, okay? These are special forces type guys. And they started talking. Every single one of them reported the same thing. They all were floating. They all recognized that Jose's foot was fine. And then several of them said they went further into the light and encountered their own relatives. This is called a shared death experience because it was several people having a near-death experience, and the frequency of their electromagnetic souls was overlapping with the frequencies of everybody else. That's why they all got I don't want to say caught up in, but intertwined, entangled, quantum entangled in this transition between the material world dimension and the other side. And this has been very heavily documented and studied for decades. So the hot shots, I think, is one of the most fascinating pieces of objective evidence that near-death experiences and shared-death experiences are real.
Yeah. You also relate a story about a lady called Pauline who had a deathbed vision in which she actually related future events and provided details about her own funeral, which hadn't yet taken place.
Well, that's true, but instead of telling the Pauline story, I want to tell one that happened after I finished the book, which will give a lot of the same information. I was called by somebody. Her son had been found floating face down in the pool. Now, he'd had a brain tumor, and he was being treated for it, and she had gone shopping, and he was a college-age young man, and he was floating face down in the pool, and they found him, and he basically was on life support, but his brain functioning had flatlined. And she was crying, and her husband and her kids, they were all on the phone. They said, Mark, they want us to terminate life support. We don't know what to do. And all of a sudden, his spirit came through, and I started describing him. And they said, okay, yeah, that's what he looked like, and that's what and I said, he wants to talk to his father. And his father got on the phone, and he said, Giorgio and Greggy. And his father said, oh, my God. He said the young man's name was Mike, but everyone called him Mikey, and the father's name was Mike. Okay, so he was Mike Jr. He said, he used to, as a joke, call me Giorgio. I go, okay, so now we know we're communicating with him because I certainly didn't know that. He goes, I don't know what Greggio is. I said, well, the message is this. He said, don't terminate life support until Mary, his mother, was ready. And I said, and then he's talking about the planet Mars. Okay. They go, Mars? I go, he's talking about the planet Mars, and you'll know when to terminate life support. So a couple days later, Mary called me, and she said, Mark, we terminated life support. I knew it was time to make the decision. And just as we were about to do this young man walked into my son's hospital room, and he was a foster we were his foster parents, and his name was Greggy. And it's like, oh, my God. So Greggy showed up right at the time that life support was to be terminated. So the spirit, even though he was still tethered to the body, was able to perceive a future event. And she goes, remember that thing you said about Mars? She said, well, that night we were all in the backyard of our house talking, and my other son goes, look at that star. It's so bright orange. It's Mars. And the whole family was together, and they realized this was their sign. And what's fascinating about this phenomenon is it shows that even though a spirit may still be energetically tethered to a dying body, the spirit is pure energy, pure consciousness, and capable of perceiving what you and I may consider to be future events, because as quantum physicists have explained, on the subatomic level, there appears not to be time, that everything is happening simultaneously. And I know that's a lot to digest, but that's one of the reasons that I wrote The Afterlife Frequency.
No, that's an incredible story, yes, and the book is full of incredible stories. What is it that clearly you want people to know that it is true, but what else would you like this book to do?
I think to bring comfort, and if I have a message for the world, it's a 5-point message. It's that the divine power that we call God exists, that heaven, the afterlife, eternal life exists, that our soul is an immortal living spirit. Fourth, that we can communicate with souls. And fifth, that we will be reunited with our loved ones in the light when it is our appointed time to leave the material world.
So what do you know? I mean, you've delved so deeply into the science, the neuroscience, every part of it. What do you know that you might like to share with our listeners before we close, that about the future of, where this is going? Oh, you spoke earlier about you think that we are going to have the cell phone in this century, but what else do you think might happen?
I think that the more we understand vibration and frequency on a cellular level, I think that not only will there be advances in spirit communication, but I think that we're going to have devices which can actually begin to cure illnesses by raising vibrational frequency and realigning damaged energy centers. And if we had more time, I would certainly be happy to go into that. But I think that provided humans aren't stupid enough to blow ourselves into non-existence, and unfortunately, given our track record, I have misgivings about that. But I tend to be an optimist, and provided we're able to restrain ourselves, I think that frequency and understanding quantum physics, I think that the barriers between faith and science will begin to erode, and we'll have a more enlightened and positive view not only of the afterlife, but of how to put our brain trust together to cure the ills of this planet.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And we need that information, because it's only when we do understand the connection between us all and, the limitless nature of us that we'll stop beating on one another and creating war.
I've been very honored throughout my life. I've met Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, John Glenn, Mike Foreman, and even Bill Nelson, who's a politician that they sent into space on one of the shuttles. And I had the opportunity to talk to all of them. I remember talking to John Glenn the longest. It was really wonderful talking to him. I said, so what was it like? What was it like when you looked down and looked at Earth? And he said, Mark, it was so beautiful. You see this beautiful blue, like giant drop of water, and you can see all the teeming life on it. And then you realize it's so fragile, and it's the only place we have to live. Let me tell you, that really resonated with me.
Yeah. I wish we did have more time, Mark Anthony, but I'm afraid we don't, so you'll have to come back again, and we'll go a bit deeper. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, been an honor, and thank you to all the listeners. Many blessings.
Thank you. The Afterlife Frequency, the scientific proof of spiritual contact and how that awareness will change your life, by Mark Anthony, the psychic lawyer, is published by New World Library and available everywhere. You can learn more at afterlifefrequency.com. That's it for tonight's show. Thank you for your company. I'll be back at the same time next week with another edition of What is Going On. Till then, it's goodbye from me.